Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. To understand human memory is to accept a profound paradox. Our most vivid, fiercely protected recollections are often the most fragile. We treat our minds like high-definition video recorders, assuming that the events of our lives are stored safely in an unalterable vault. In reality, memory is less like a video recording and more like a live theatrical performance, rewritten and restaged every time the curtain rises. This malleability becomes exceptionally critical and infinitely more complex when the brain is subjected to the crushing weight of high stress and trauma. When a sudden, life-altering event strikes, whether it is a personal tragedy like an accident or assault, or a societal cataclysm like a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, or a global pandemic, the brain's recording apparatus is hijacked. Stress hormones flood the system, altering the very molecular foundations of how memories are encoded, stored, and retrieved. But this phenomenon does not stop at the boundaries of the individual's skull. As individuals share their fragmented, emotionally charged experiences, a broader phenomenon takes shape: collective recall. Entire societies begin to remember, misremember, and reshape historical events, weaving a shared narrative that can span decades and even physically alter the genetic expression of future generations. Today, we are going to explore the intersection of memory consolidation and trauma. We will journey from the microscopic synapses of the human brain to the sprawling intergenerational epics of human society. It is a story of how high stress burns its signature into our minds, how communities build shared realities out of shared pain, and how we can ultimately find pathways to collective healing. To comprehend what happens to memory under extreme stress, we must first understand how memory functions under normal conditions. The creation of a long-term memory is not instantaneous. It is a time-dependent, biologically demanding process known as memory consolidation. When you experience a new event, the sensory information, the sights, sounds, smells, and emotional undertones, is initially held in a fragile temporary state. This is short-term, or working, memory. For this fleeting experience to transform into a permanent fixture of your autobiography, it must undergo synaptic and systems consolidation. Synaptic consolidation occurs within the first few hours after learning, involving structural and chemical changes at the junctions between neurons, known as synapses. Over weeks, months, or even years, systems consolidation takes over, reorganizing the memory across wider cortical networks. At the heart of this process is the hippocampus, a seahorse-shaped structure buried deep in the brain's temporal lobe. The hippocampus acts as the brain's chief librarian. It catalogs the disparate elements of an experience, the location, the time of day, the sequence of events, and binds them together into a coherent, time-stamped narrative. When you recall what you had for breakfast or a recent conversation with a friend, you are relying on the hippocampus to retrieve these contextual details. Working adjacent to the hippocampus is the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center and primary threat detector. Under normal circumstances, the amygdala and hippocampus operate in tandem. The amygdala flags an event as emotionally significant, essentially telling the hippocampus, "This matters. File it away safely." However, when the dial of emotional intensity is cranked past significant into the realm of traumatic, this harmonious partnership violently ruptures. The human response to a traumatic event is an evolutionary masterpiece designed for immediate survival. But it comes at a steep cognitive cost. When a profound threat is detected, the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, are thrown into overdrive. The brain is flooded with a cocktail of neurochemicals, most notably adrenaline, noradrenaline, and glucocorticoids like cortisol. These stress hormones act as a massive amplifier for the amygdala. The amygdala becomes hyperactive, intensely encoding the emotional and sensory fragments of the threat. Think of the screech of tires, the smell of smoke, the visceral feeling of terror. But while the amygdala is empowered by this chemical flood, the hippocampus is actively suppressed by high levels of glucocorticoids. The librarian is essentially locked out of the filing room. This neurobiological divergence explains the defining characteristics of traumatic memories. Because the hippocampus is inhibited, the memory is not properly time-stamped or integrated into the continuous narrative of the person's life. It is decontextualized. Meanwhile, Because the amygdala is supercharged, the emotional and sensory imprints of the memory are deeply entrenched. This is why, for survivors of trauma, the past does not feel like the past. When triggered by a sound, a smell, or a situational cue, the memory is not simply recalled, it is relived. Intrusive memories and flashbacks, the hallmarks of post-traumatic stress disorder, are the result of these floating, unintegrated sensory fragments intruding upon the present moment. Recent neuroimaging studies have shown that when PTSD patients are asked to recall sad or neutral memories, their brain activity looks highly synchronized and typical. However, when they recall their traumatic experiences, the activity in the hippocampus becomes highly individualized, fragmented, and disorganized. As researchers note, these traumatic imprints are not like memories at all, but rather isolated shards of unassimilated experience. For decades, the scientific consensus was that once a memory was fully consolidated, it was permanent. Imagine a book printed and bound, sitting on a dusty shelf. However, groundbreaking neuroscience in the late 20th and early 21st centuries shattered this paradigm with the discovery of reconsolidation. Researchers found that when a long-term memory is retrieved, it does not simply appear in the mind's eye, it becomes chemically labile and vulnerable to modification all over again. The memory must be restabilized or reconsolidated back into the brain's architecture. Every time we remember something, we are not pulling up the original file, we are pulling up the last time we remembered it. We essentially rewrite our memories every time we access them. This inherent malleability of memory is both a curse and a cure in the context of trauma. On one hand, it explains why eyewitness testimonies can become corrupted, and why the retelling of a traumatic event can inadvertently reinforce the fear associated with it if recalled in a state of panic. On the other hand, the window of reconsolidation offers a profound therapeutic opportunity. If a traumatic memory is recalled, and a pharmacological agent like propranolol, a beta blocker that dampens the noradrenergic stress response, is administered during the reconsolidation window, the emotional bite of the memory can be significantly reduced. The patient still remembers the factual occurrence of the event, but the devastating visceral panic is uncoupled from the narrative. Similarly, therapies like eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, and prolonged exposure utilize the reconsolidation window to help the brain properly file the traumatic memory, moving it from the reactive amygdala into the historical context of the hippocampus. When we scale the concept of memory from the individual to the collective, the dynamics of emotional memory consolidation take on a fascinating new dimension. This is most vividly illustrated by the phenomenon of flashbulb memories. First coined by psychologists Roger Brown and James Kulik in 1977, following their study on how people remembered the assassination of John F. Kennedy, a flashbulb memory is a highly vivid, detailed recollection of the exact moment one learned about a shocking, emotionally charged public event. Brown and Kulik suggested that high emotional intensity triggers a now-print mechanism in the brain, capturing a snapshot of the moment with photographic precision. If you are old enough to remember the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, you likely have a flashbulb memory of that day. You can probably visualize exactly where you were, who you were with, what you were wearing, and the precise feelings of shock and dread that washed over you. The same phenomenon applies to older generations regarding the attack on Pearl Harbor, or more recently, the sudden onset of COVID-19 lockdowns in March 2020. However, modern psychological studies have revealed a startling truth about flashbulb memories. Their accuracy decays at the same rate as ordinary memories, but our confidence in their accuracy remains staggeringly high. A 10-year follow-up study on memories of 9/11 demonstrated that while people's accounts of how they heard the news shifted, distorted, or completely changed over a decade, their belief that their memory was flawless never wavered. The immense emotional glue of the event convinces the brain that the memory is perfect, even when it is highly flawed. Flashbulb memories serve a vital social function. They act as a badge of historical participation. When we share our flashbulb memories of a collective trauma, we are not just exchanging facts, we are demonstrating our authentic witness to a shared cultural rupture. The memory bonds the individual to the group, creating a unified fabric of collective experience. Individual trauma occurs when a person's psychic framework is overwhelmed by a threat. Collective trauma occurs when a society's foundational fabric, its sense of safety, its moral order, its identity, is shattered by a catastrophic event. Wars, genocides, economic collapses, pandemics, and mass casualty terrorist attacks generate ripples of high stress that affect millions simultaneously. When a society is thrust into a high-stress survival mode, collective memory consolidation begins. Just as the individual brain struggles to integrate fragmented traumatic memories, a society struggles to construct a coherent narrative out of chaos. The process of shaping this collective recall is highly malleable and heavily influenced by social discourse, media representation, and political framing. In the immediate aftermath of a collective trauma, there is a feverish surge of social sharing. After the November 2015 terrorist attacks in Paris, for instance, surveys showed that 94% of the French population had actively discussed the event with loved ones within days. This self-disclosure is crucial for active adaptation and resilience. By speaking about the unspeakable, individuals co-regulate their nervous systems and begin the painstaking work of narrative construction. However, because the memories are forged in the crucible of high adrenaline and cortisol, the collective narrative is highly susceptible to distortion, hypervigilance, and an us versus them mentality. When a community's fight-or-flight response is engaged, social memories consolidate around themes of survival, threat detection, and the identification of enemies. A trauma lodged in the memory of an entire community can cause individuals to turn inward, clinging to the familiar and pushing out those perceived as different, often leading to xenophobia or social fracture. Furthermore, collective memory is not history. History is the objective attempt to separate the past from the present. Collective memory, conversely, brings the past directly into the present, to serve the emotional and political needs of the community. Societies actively select what to remember and, just as importantly, what to selectively forget. Through monuments, commemorative days, political speeches, and educational curricula, societies repeatedly reconsolidate their collective memories. Just as a retrieved individual memory is altered before it is stored again, a society's memory of a traumatic event is edited each time it is publicly commemorated, ensuring the narrative aligns with the current societal identity. The impact of high-stress events on memory and identity is not confined to the generation that experiences the trauma firsthand. One of the most paradigm-shifting discoveries in recent biological science is the revelation that the neurobiological scars of trauma can be passed down to subsequent generations, a phenomenon known as transgenerational or intergenerational trauma. Historically, psychology explained the transmission of trauma across generations purely through behavioral and sociocultural mechanisms. Parents who survived horrific events like the Holocaust, the Holodomor, or the transatlantic slave trade understandably suffered from severe PTSD, hypervigilance, and emotional dysregulation. These traumatized states influenced their parenting styles. Children raised in households where the environment was highly stressful, emotionally volatile, or shrouded in unspeakable grief implicitly learned that the world was inherently dangerous. The trauma was transmitted through disorganized attachment, family narratives, and the social modeling of fear. However, cutting-edge research in the field of epigenetics has proven that the transmission of trauma goes much deeper than learned behavior. It is etched into the molecular memory of our cells. Epigenetics is the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way genes work. Unlike genetic mutations, epigenetic changes do not alter the underlying DNA sequence. Instead, they add chemical tags, like methyl groups, to the DNA, which turn certain genes on or off. When an individual experiences prolonged, extreme stress, the flood of stress hormones can cause epigenetic changes, particularly in the genes responsible for regulating the HPA axis and cortisol production, such as the NR3C1 and FKBP5 genes. Dr. Rachel Yehuda, a pioneer in this field, conducted landmark studies on Holocaust survivors and their children. She discovered that both the survivors and their offspring exhibited distinct epigenetic alterations that affected their cortisol levels and made them highly sensitive to stress. The offspring, despite never having seen a concentration camp, had inherited a biological alarm system that was permanently set to a hair trigger sensitivity. Similar findings have been documented in other historically traumatized populations. Studies on the descendants of women who endured the Dutch famine of 1944 to 1945 revealed that the children and grandchildren of these women had epigenetic modifications that predisposed them to obesity and metabolic disorders. Their bodies had genetically remembered starvation and were hoarding calories in anticipation of a famine they had never experienced. Epigenetic markers linked to trauma have also been observed in the descendants of survivors of the 9/11 attacks, indigenous populations subjected to colonization, and combat veterans. In a very real biological sense, trauma becomes a bridge between memory and molecule. The unhealed wounds of the past become an embodied inheritance. The high-stress environments of ancestors sculpt the biological hardware of their descendants, preparing them for a world of threats that may no longer exist, predisposing them to anxiety, depression, and PTSD. While epigenetics provides the biological substrate for inherited trauma, the sociocultural transmission remains equally powerful. The collective recall of a community is heavily dictated by what is spoken and what is shrouded in silence. In many traumatized societies, an overwhelming conspiracy of silence takes hold. Survivors, overwhelmed by shame, guilt, or the sheer horror of their memories, cannot speak of what happened. Yet this silence is deafening to the next generation. Children are highly adept at reading the non-verbal cues of their caregivers. The sudden flinch, the avoidance of certain topics or places, the unexplainable bouts of despair. This creates vicarious memories. The children absorb the emotional weight of the trauma without possessing the factual narrative to contextualize it. Furthermore, systemic and structural realities perpetuate collective trauma. When a marginalized group is subjected to historical atrocities, the trauma is often compounded by ongoing systemic oppression, poverty, and a lack of social validation. If a society refuses to acknowledge the trauma of a specific group, denying them justice, memorials, or a place in the official historical record, the trauma cannot be integrated. It remains an open, festering wound in the collective psyche, passed down not just through altered stress genes, but through enduring cycles of poverty, marginalization, and repeated victimization. If high-stress events can physically alter individual brains, distort collective memories, and rewrite the epigenetic code of future generations, how can we possibly heal? The answer lies in applying our understanding of memory, malleability, and consolidation to both clinical practice and societal reconstruction. Let us look at rewiring the individual. For individuals suffering from the fragmented, hyper-aroused memories of trauma, healing requires moving the memory from the amygdala to the hippocampus. Interventions detailed by pioneers like Bessel van der Kolk emphasize that the body keeps the score. Because trauma disrupts the brain's language centers and isolates sensory experiences, traditional talk therapy is often insufficient. Somatic therapies, yoga, EMDR, and psychedelics, like MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, are increasingly utilized to help patients calm their nervous systems enough to safely access the trauma. By retrieving the memory in a state of physical safety, the brain can properly timestamp the event, reconsolidating it not as a present threat, but as a concluded historical event. On a societal level, collective trauma cannot be healed in the shadows. Truth, validation, and meaning-making are essential. Just as an individual must contextualize a memory to heal from PTSD, a society must openly confront and contextualize its historical traumas. Unacknowledged trauma is toxic. Truth and reconciliation commissions, such as those in South Africa or Canada, serve a vital neurobiological and sociological function. By providing a public platform for survivors to speak their truth and have their pain socially validated, societies prevent the trauma from becoming a disenfranchised taboo subject. It allows the community to collectively process the memory, moving it from a state of raw, unacknowledged pain to a shared historical understanding. We must also recognize the power of ritual and memorialization. Indigenous frameworks of healing have long recognized that trauma is a rupture in the relational balance of a community, requiring collective mourning and ritual reparation. Monuments, commemorative ceremonies, and public mourning rituals act as anchors for collective memory. They provide a safe, structured container for society to access the high-stress memory, grieve it, and safely store it away again. It is a societal form of exposure therapy and memory reconsolidation. By intentionally crafting these memorials, societies can dictate how the memory is framed, shifting the narrative from one of perpetual victimhood to one of endurance, solidarity, and resilience. Finally, breaking the transgenerational chain is entirely possible. While epigenetic changes highlight the enduring legacy of trauma, it is crucial to recognize that epigenetics is not destiny. The very mechanisms that allow stress to alter gene expression also allow healing to alter gene expression. Safe, enriching environments, strong communal support, and targeted therapeutic interventions can reverse epigenetic markers of stress. By creating secure attachments for children and breaking cycles of systemic violence, societies can biologically rewrite the legacy they leave for the future. Memory is not a sterile archive. It is a living, breathing, and fiercely adaptive system. When subjected to the inferno of high stress and trauma, the human mind prioritizes survival over accuracy, burning emotional fragments deep into our biology while sacrificing context. This neurobiological triage saves lives in the short term, but leaves a legacy of fragmented recall, hyperarousal, and pain. As these individual experiences scale upward, they forge the collective recall of entire societies. Shared traumas become the foundational myths of cultures, influencing political landscapes, social cohesion, and the very genetic code passed down in the womb. We are, quite literally, the biological and narrative culmination of what our ancestors survived. Yet, recognizing the profound malleability of memory under stress is not a cause for despair, it is a blueprint for liberation. Because memory is constantly being reconstructed, it can be healed. By understanding the neuroscience of memory consolidation, the biological reality of inherited trauma, and the sociological power of shared narrative, we can stop being passive victims of our past. We can actively choose how we remember. We can design therapies, public rituals, and social policies that prioritize integration over fragmentation. In doing so, we not only heal the traumas of yesterday and today, but we rewrite the biological and cultural inheritance we pass on to the generations of tomorrow. Thank you for joining us today on Fun Facts Online.